With respect, if I could turn your attention to January 28th into January 29th, sort of Friday into a Saturday. Do you recall 2022? Do you recall those days? Okay, were you working one of those 2 days?
I was scheduled to work the morning of the 29th, I believe.
So you were scheduled to work essentially the morning, 8 a.m. on the 29th until 8 a.m. on the 30th? Correct. And prior to, or the 28th sort of going into the 29th, what, if anything, were you aware of as far as weather that had been forecasted or that was reportedly coming in?
So I was aware that there was a significant storm, supposedly. Well, there was a significant storm coming through. I woke up very early that morning just to check. I took a peek outside of my house. I live in the city of Brockton. I noticed that the conditions it was starting to snow a little bit. So I got up early and got ready for work and left earlier than I normally do.
And about what time, which station were you assigned to on that?
I was at Station 1, 99 Revere Street, and I was on Ambulance 1 for the day.
And about what time did you arrive at Station 1?
Due to the inclement weather, I believe I arrived several hours early. I showed up to the station around 5:45, 5:50 that morning.
And around the time that you were driving from your home to Station 1 in Canton, what, if anything, did you note as far as sort of the driving conditions, visibility, anything like that?
The snow was starting to accumulate. The roads, I drove through several towns, but the roads were starting to be treated, but they weren't pristine. There was obviously a buildup of snow starting on my ride, which was part of the reason I left early, just either to relieve people if they needed to get out before the storm really hit, or just to help them with snow removal.
And to that point, when it comes to sort of snow removal at the fire station, what, if any, sort of duties and responsibilities do yourself and the other firefighters have in relation to snow removal around the station?
So we're responsible around the station to keep what we refer to as the apron clear of snow. The apron is where we back our fire trucks into and out of the station. So we remove all that ourselves. We have a plow truck. However, we'll also shovel walkways and stuff for the public if they need to get in. So that was one of the primary. The crew was actually outside removing snow when I pulled in to the station that morning.
And it may be pretty self-explanatory, but as far as the apron itself, why is it so necessary that the apron remain clear as far as snow is concerned?
Just to maintain a path for the emergency apparatus to get in and out in a timely manner.
Now, beyond sort of the snow accumulation that you noted on your way to work that day, what, if anything else, did you note as far as the weather conditions, whether it be temperature, winds, anything to that effect?
They were approaching blizzard conditions. It was windy. It was still very early in the morning, so it was quite dark, and it was windy and snowy. So we were approaching blizzard conditions, like I said.
And when you arrived there, did a call come into your station sometime around or shortly after 6 o'clock in the morning on the 29th?
Yeah, I arrived, as I previously stated, around 5:50. I had put my gear, my firefighting structural gear, out with Ambulance 1 just in the event that there was an emergency. And as I was doing that, the emergency tones went off for a medical.
Do you recall what was the report in regard to, what was the dispatch in regard to as far as the medical was concerned?
The overhead dispatch came in as a unresponsive male in a snowbank at 34 Fairview Road outside. Unclear any further information. So when that came on, we had one of the paramedics that morning and one of the firefighters who was a relatively new firefighter. I made the decision to step onto the ambulance to provide an extra set of hands as one of the more senior paramedics in the station at the time.
And correct me if I'm wrong, when you step onto the ambulance, you're essentially still sort of getting your gear on and getting dressed, correct?
Correct. I was, as the tones were going off, and because I came in so early, I was still in civilian clothing. I had a Canton Fire t-shirt on. So I actually donned my turnout gear for that call.
And as far as the other individuals on that ambulance one that were going to that call as well, who were they?
So it was firefighter paramedic Anthony Flamati and firefighter EMT Matt Kelly.
And Mr. Kelly, he was sort of the less experienced one at that time, is that correct?
Correct.
So you get into the back of the ambulance and start going to the scene. Now, as far as other sort of vehicles or apparatus, who, if anyone, or what, if any, other sort of vehicles were dispatched on this call as well?
The initial dispatch was Canton Engine 3 and Canton Ambulance 1. Due to the severity of the call, depending on how it comes in, the shift commander, which is car 5, he will usually respond to any significant incident. So he also added himself to the call, just as a senior officer with us. So the final dispatch, I believe, was car 5, engine 3, and ambulance 1.
You know who was on engine 3 and who was in car 5?
Car 5 was Captain Robbery. Engine 3 was Lieutenant Greg Woodbury, firefighter Frank Walsh, and firefighter Katie McLaughlin.
As far as the ambulance 1 that you were in, obviously there's somebody driving and there's somebody in the front passenger seat, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and so who was driving and who was in the front passenger seat?
I don't want to speak out of turn. I honestly can't tell you who was driving. I was in the back. I was in the back patient compartment of the ambulance, just because there's only 2 seats up front, so I hopped in the back.
Okay. And so when you're in the back of the ambulance and you're going to the call, what is it that you're doing in sort of preparation for arrival?
So as I previously stated, I came in early, so I was donning my turnout gear. I had my boots and structural firefighting pants on. So I finished putting those on, and I put the rest of my gear in the back. And as we were driving to the scene of the incident, I started prepping the gear that we were going to need off the initial dispatch, an unresponsive male in the snow. So I grabbed our first in bag, which has miscellaneous medical supplies, some IV supplies, and interosseous drill kit. The airway bag, which has just a bottle of oxygen, and then quite a bit of airway management supplies, and our cardiac monitor. So I had all of those prepped out and ready to go. So as soon as the ambulance was in park, we could step right out, ascertain what we had, and go from there. So when the ambulance arrived on scene, I had all 3 of those bags on my person, and we were able to, the entire ambulance crew was able to step out and provide patient care.
And as far as, if you know, approximately how much time elapsed between the time that you hear sort of the sound go off and you get in the ambulance to the time that you arrive on scene on Fairview?
I couldn't give you an accurate estimation of the time. Like I said, I was in the back. I was trying to prep everything and get myself kind of prepped just in terms of appropriate attire. So I couldn't give you a fair estimate.
And as far as when you arrive on scene, you step out of the back of the ambulance, is that correct?
Yes.
And as far as the weather conditions where you were on Fairview, what, if any, difference was there between the weather conditions there versus the weather conditions when you were arriving at the station?
I remember, as I previously stated, I remember it was still very dark. The sun was not up yet. I remember the wind. It was quite windy that morning. The wind had, in my opinion, had seemed to have picked up since my drive in, and the snow was increased.
And so when you step out of the ambulance, can you describe for the jury sort of where you go and sort of what is it that you first see when you get out there?
So I stepped out of the ambulance and came around with all 3 bags. I could hear commotion. I could hear some screaming off in the distance. I couldn't really tell you where it was coming from because it was still quite dark. Came around the passenger side of the ambulance, walked in front of the ambulance, and there was a small huddle of 3 individuals and what appeared to be a human form laying in the snow. So we made our way over to that and went from there.
And when you come around the passenger side of the ambulance and you observe that and start to, are you sort of turning left or right, or how are you heading when you come around the ambulance?
I came out of the ambulance on the passenger side and I took a left.
And you make your way over to the patient on the ground, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And as far as the other people that you observed around the patient, how would you, or what, if any, description do you have of those people?
There were 3 individuals. I believe they were all 3 of them were female. My primary focus was the individual in the snow on the ground. I went right to him. I kind of bypassed everybody from there and went directly to that individual.
Does that sort of typically how you approach a scene, is just sort of tunnel vision right for the patient?
Typically on a call like that, where if somebody's unresponsive on the ground, you typically go directly to the patient and ascertain if they are breathing and if they have signs of life, because that is a time-sensitive matter.
And as far as the individual, not then, but at some point subsequent, did you learn the identity of the person on the ground?
It did. It was Officer O'Keefe, John O'Keefe.
And how was Officer Mr. O'Keefe's body positioned in relation to the ground when you first approached?
So I found him supine, laying in the snow. Immediately went to him and checked him for signs of life. We found none. We found no breathing, no pulse. So we immediately began performing high-quality CPR. I was at the head of the individual, so I immediately grabbed out of our airway bag a bag valve mask and began ventilating the patient, trying to get some oxygen into him while the others on scene, like I said, began high-quality CPR.
And again, maybe pretty well understood, but when you use the term supine, what exactly do you mean?
He was laying on his back.
Laying on his back, his head sort of facing up, is that correct?
Correct.
And when you are responding to a call of this nature, there's you and there's other individuals on the ambulance as well, correct?
Correct.
And is there a certain division as far as treatment and diagnosis and things of that nature are concerned between you and the other people on the ambulance?
So typically, just to use the scenario of a cardiac arrest with two paramedics, it's generally split into the airway individual or the airway monitor and the, lack of a better term, code monitor. The airway individual will be responsible for ventilation and eventually advanced airway placement. The other part of that equation will monitor cardiac status, cardiac activity. They will deliver medications and a route for those medications, and they will work together to monitor that patient throughout. As I said, I was on the head. I just happened to fall at the head, so I took the ventilation portion of that.
And you use the term as far as a bag valve mask, is
Yep.
that correct? And
Correct.
can you explain to the jury sort of what that is?
All that is it's, for lack of a better term, it's basically a glorified balloon with a mask on it. When you squeeze that bag, that forces air into the airway, so you can ventilate an individual who is no longer breathing on their own.
And as far as, obviously, with your work with the fire department, there are sort of records or reports that are written in regard to treatment of different individuals on any given call, correct?
Correct.
And is there an acronym that's used within those reports as far as bag valve mask?
BVM.
And turning back to sort of when you initially approach where Mr. O'Keefe is, if you know, about how far away from, where is he in relation to, well, let me back up to sleep, okay? So you arrive at this residence at 34 Fairview Road, correct?
Yep.
Okay. So if I'm standing on the street and I'm facing Fairview Road, is Mr. O'Keefe's body to the left, to the right, center, or something else?
I would say to the left of center.
And what, if anything, did you sort of note or observe sort of in the general area as far as where Mr. O'Keefe was?
In terms of when I got to him?
Yes.
So when I first got to him, we checked for signs of life, and I was, as stated, at the head. There was a small pool of blood that seemed to be underneath him. It was hard to ascertain, again, because of the conditions. It was still very dark. It was snowing, and it was quite windy. So we were able to check the area as best we could with our handheld lights. But that was one of the things that I noted. There was a pool of blood.
Now, where Mr. O'Keefe's body was in relation to the roadway, if you know, about how far away, where was it in relation to the roadway?
I estimated it about where the sidewalk met the front lawn of that residence. That would be my best estimation.
Do you have any estimate as far as footage or anything like that?
I would say about 6-8 feet, perhaps.
So it's approximately 6 to 8 feet from
Yeah.
the curb.
Correct.
So you indicated that sort of what are the first things that you're checking as far as when you first arrive at a patient for this kind of thing?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
That's okay. That's okay. It's my fault. So as far as when you, let me back you up for just 1 second.
Sorry.
You use a term in there as far as a cardiac arrest, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what you understand that term to mean based on your training and experience?
So cardiac arrest is the cessation of a stable cardiac rhythm in terms of life. Typically, it's either asystole, pulseless electrical activity, or VFib or VTAC. Typically, you ascertain that, but there's no pulse. You check any of the pulses, be it a femoral pulse, a carotid pulse, or a radial pulse, you will find nothing. And when that is found, you go to life-saving measures, which is CPR.
And just in reference to one other term you used in there as far as asystole, if you could explain to the jury what you understand that term to mean based on your training experience.
Asystole, to put it as clear as I can, is a flat line. There's no electrical activity in the heart.
And so you're working sort of at the head of Mr. O'Keefe, is that correct?
Correct.
And sort of while he's still on the ground, and what is it that you're specifically sort of doing in reference to your treatment at that point?
So I was, as we talked about earlier, I had a BVM, bag valve mask, and I had Mr. O'Keefe, I was ventilating him. So I had the mask on his face, and I was giving him positive pressure breaths with that BVM.
And as you're doing that, what, if anything else, did you observe beyond sort of the blood pooling you've already talked about as far as any tactile observations you made of Mr. O'Keefe, any visual observations you made of Mr. O'Keefe at that point outside of the ambulance?
He was dressed for the weather. He had several layers on. Other than that, our primary focus was kind of getting him extricated and out of the elements, just because it was, as stated, conditions were suboptimal, and we wanted to get him into an environment with better lighting and some heat, so we could further assess if he had any injuries and go from there.
And so the other firefighters, paramedics, excuse me, that are on the ambulance with you, while you're doing sort of the back valve mask at his head, what, if anything, are they doing?
I believe the other firefighters that were dispatched, they were getting extrication equipment. I believe we put this individual on what we refer to as a scoop stretcher, which is basically a long plastic stretcher that we can roll an individual onto and then just pick him up, just for our safety and the safety of the patient. It's just really just a long board that we can pick up and then put onto our ambulance stretcher. So somebody was grabbing the scoop stretcher, somebody else was grabbing the ambulance stretcher, and I believe that was a coordinated effort on their part.
And I apologize for keep going back and forth, but if I could take you back just one moment before that. So when you first sort of arrived to Mr. O'Keefe, you mentioned that there are 3 females sort of huddled around, is that correct?
Correct.
And what, if anything, did you observe any of those females doing with respect to Mr. O'Keefe when you first got there?
That group seemed to be agitated. There was it was a scene of heightened emotions. As I stated, when I stepped out of the ambulance, I could hear screaming, I could hear people yelling, and it seemed just to be that group was just quite agitated.
Now, at some point, you are able to get him on the scoop stretcher and then over to the ambulance, correct?
Correct.
And when you get to the ambulance, what, if anything, did you note as far as what, if any, difference was there in the lighting in the back of the ambulance versus on the front lawn?
The lighting was significantly better. All of our ambulances have fluorescent lighting in the ceiling of the ambulance, so those were on And we were able to see that there was some more injuries once we were able to get him out of his winter clothing.
And so, to that point, when you sort of first get into the back of the ambulance, what is sort of the protocol? What is it that each of you are sort of doing with respect to patient care at that point?
So the biggest priority is continuous high-quality CPR. And that is the biggest thing with any cardiac arrest is uninterruption of compressions. So when we got him into the back of the ambulance, we continued CPR throughout. So while multiple people were performing CPR and eventually a mechanical CPR device was applied, those compressions were uninterrupted and others were removing clothing, I honestly couldn't tell you the number of articles of clothing, but I believe a winter jacket and a sweatshirt were removed, and then eventually he was all the clothing was removed, and that's protocol for any cardiac arrest or any traumatic injury is usually all clothing is removed so we can have unfettered access to the individual to see if there are any other injuries.
And why is that the protocol, sir?
You mentioned earlier, sir, that there is tunnel vision. The absence of clothing kind of helps to remove that so you can see everything. You can assess everything.
And you mentioned sort of a mechanical means of CPR. Is there a specific device that's used for that?
Yes, we use a Lucas device manufactured by Stryker, and for lack of a better term, it's basically just a plunger that does CPR. It frees up a set of hands for us, and that can provide CPR uninterrupted as long as the batteries last.
Now, at the time that you get Mr. O'Keefe into the back of the ambulance and you removing some of the clothing, what, if anything, did you note at that time or at any subsequent time in regard to footwear?
To be candid, I wasn't really looking at the footwear. I believe it was brought to my attention when we eventually transferred patient care at Good Samaritan Medical Center that the individual was missing a shoe. However, that wasn't my primary focus at the time.
And the items of clothing that were removed from within the ambulance, eventually when you transfer that patient care to the hospital, what, if anything, happens with that?
In terms of the chain of custody of the clothing, that is typically brought in either with the individual or after, and that is usually deposited on the floor of the room where that patient is, and then the hospital takes custody of it. Occasionally we'll put it in bags. However, I could not speak to where that clothing went on this case.
But fair to say whatever clothing was taken off in the ambulance left the ambulance at some point?
Correct.
Okay, and went to the hospital, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, when you have Mr. O'Keefe in the back of the ambulance and the lighting is better, what, if anything, did you observe following sort of the removal of the clothing as far as what, if any, injuries did you observe to Mr. O'Keefe in that sense?
He was noted to have, and I was right at the head, he was noted to have a hematoma on the right side of his face, just above his eye on his forehead. And there was some scratches on the right arm, the upper arm.
And you used the term as far as a hematoma. Could you explain what you understand that term to me?
Lack of a better term is just an egg. He had a pretty good egg on his head.
And as far as anything beyond that, did you observe anything or note anything beyond the egg on the head and the scratches on the right arm?
As we got further down our treatment modality, we went to place an advanced airway. It was noted to have some blood, some mucus, and some bile in the back of his airway that was then suctioned out before we placed our endotracheal tube.
And what is an endotracheal tube?
So an endotracheal tube is basically, it's just a plastic tube that is passed through the mouth into the trachea through the vocal cords. It's a definitive airway, if you will. It isolates the trachea so you can better ventilate your patient, and you don't have to worry about any air getting into the stomach, any gastric insufflation. And that is the gold standard for cardiac arrest, is a properly placed intratracheal tube.
You mentioned there were some substances that were suctioned from his airway, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and what were they again? I'm sorry.
I believe it was blood, bile, and mucus.
And do you have any idea how much of that was suctioned?
I couldn't give you an exact number, but it was enough that we needed to set up a suction system to remove it before we intubated.
And just turning briefly again to the arm, these were injuries that you observed on his right arm, is that correct?
Correct.
What, if any, injuries did you observe on his left arm?
I don't believe I saw any, to my knowledge.
And as far as your memory, as far as his right arm, how far did it sort of extend and where was it located? Sort of upper arm, lower arm, both, or where was it?
I believe it was just below his shoulder.